I found out my mom isn't my real mom. And it ruined everything. I always thought I knew my family, my mom, my dad, everything about them. But one day, that all changed. It started like any other day, and I had no idea that my entire life was about to be turned upside down. I came home from school to find my mom sitting at the kitchen table, looking unusually serious. She wasn't crying, but there was something in her eyes that told me something was wrong. My dad was sitting next to her, his expression just as tense. I didn't know it yet, but that look would haunt me for the rest of my life. "Sit down, honey," my mom said softly, motioning to the chair across from her. "We need to talk." I sat down, and the second I did, I felt the weight of the situation. I couldn't put my finger on it, but everything felt off. Something was wrong. "Your father and I have something we need to tell you," she began, her voice trembling. "This isn't easy, but it's important you know the truth." I just stared at her, waiting. My mind was racing, but I couldn't imagine what they were about to say. What could be so important that it was making them act this way? "We're not your real parents," my dad said quietly, almost as if he couldn't bear to say the words. It hit me like a punch to the stomach. The room spun, and I couldn't catch my breath. My parents weren't my real parents. What did that even mean? What? I stuttered, barely able to process what was happening. They looked at each other for a moment, and then my mom spoke again, this time more gently. "You were adopted when you were just a baby. We've loved you as our own, but we felt you should know the truth." I sat there in stunned silence. It didn't feel real. The world around me seemed to shift, like everything I knew about my life was suddenly a lie. Why hadn't they told me this before? "We didn't tell you earlier because we wanted to protect you," my dad explained. "But now, we think you need to know. There's more to the story." I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. Who was I? Who were they? What was happening? My mind was racing as I tried to make sense of what they had just told me. Everything I had known, every memory, every moment, it was all suddenly clouded in doubt. "Why are you telling me this now?" I finally managed to ask, my voice shaking. "What's changed?" My mom sighed and looked at my dad. There was something between them, something unspoken. My dad stood up and walked over to the window, staring out as if searching for the right words. "There's something else we need to tell you," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "Your real mother, she's still alive." The words hit me like a freight train. My real mother? Still alive? I couldn't wrap my mind around it. "But, why didn't you tell me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "We had no choice," my dad said, his tone full of regret. "It's complicated. Your birth mother, she had to leave. She was in danger. We had to protect you from the truth, from the people who were after her." The room seemed to close in on me. The walls felt like they were suffocating me, and I had to get out. I needed answers. I needed to find her. I needed to understand what was going on. That night, I barely slept. I tossed and turned, my mind swirling with questions. Who was my real mother? Why had she disappeared? And why hadn't they told me sooner? The next morning, I demanded answers. My dad reluctantly gave me a file, photos, documents, and old letters that I couldn't make sense of. There was one picture that caught my eye, a woman, young and beautiful, standing in front of a building I didn't recognize. "This is her," my dad said softly, pointing to the woman in the photo. "Your real mother." I stared at the picture, my heart racing. The woman in the photo looked nothing like me, but something in her eyes, something familiar, made my heart skip a beat. I knew this woman. I didn't know how, but I could feel it deep inside. "There's more," my dad continued. "She's in danger, and the people who've been after her, they've been watching us. Watching you." I felt a cold chill run down my spine. It was all starting to make sense, but the more I learned, the more terrifying everything became. I needed to find her, to understand what was happening, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was coming next was going to change everything. The next few days passed in a blur. We packed up everything we could carry, my dad giving me only the essentials, a few changes of clothes, my phone, some money, and a few documents that I didn't dare look at. Every time I tried to ask him about them, he would brush it off or give me vague answers, and I could feel the tension building between us. It was like I was living in a completely different world, a world where secrets were the only currency, and trust was a rare commodity. We drove for hours, stopping only when we absolutely had to. The silence in the car was deafening, broken only by the occasional soft words from my dad, telling me that everything would be okay. But I knew he didn't believe it. I could hear the fear in his voice, the uncertainty that was lingering just beneath the surface. We didn't go back to our old house. We didn't even go to any of our family's places. Instead, my dad took me to a small, secluded cabin in the middle of nowhere. It was hidden in the woods, miles away from any kind of civilization. The only people around were the animals in the forest, and even they seemed to be hiding from whatever threat was looming over us. We stayed there for days, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every time I went outside, I felt like someone, or something, was out there, keeping an eye on us. I couldn't explain it, but it was like the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. On the fourth day, I woke up to a noise. It was faint at first, like a low rumble coming from deep within the forest. But it grew louder, and I realized it was a car. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I rushed to the window and peered outside. My dad had left the cabin to gather some supplies, but I had a feeling that this was no coincidence. There, parked just outside the cabin, was a black van. The windows were tinted, so I couldn't see who was inside, but I knew instantly that whoever they weren't here to visit. They were here for me. My heart was pounding in my chest as I backed away from the window. I had to hide. I had to warn my dad. I quickly turned to grab my phone, but then I remembered. My phone had no signal out here. I was completely cut off from the outside world. Panic started to rise within me, but I forced myself to stay calm. If I ran now, I would only be putting myself in more danger. I decided to wait. I stayed as quiet as possible, hiding in the corner of the room, my eyes glued to the window, watching the van. It was strange, but I couldn't help but feel like they were waiting for something too. Minutes stretched into hours, and still, no one came out of the van. I began to wonder if it had been a mistake, maybe it wasn't what I thought it was. But then, the van doors opened, and two men stepped out. They were tall, wearing dark clothes and sunglasses, even though it was almost sunset. I couldn't make out their faces, but I could feel the coldness in the air as they moved toward the cabin. Suddenly, I heard a knock at the door. My heart skipped a beat. My dad was supposed to be back by now, was it him? But then, I realized that the knock was too quick, too deliberate to be anyone I knew. I backed up slowly, trying to make myself as small as possible. My mind was racing. What if they were here for me? What if they knew exactly where I was? I heard them outside, talking to each other, their voices low and muffled. I couldn't make out their words, but I could feel the tension building in my chest. I had to find out who they were. I had to know what was going on. Just then, I heard a car pulling up. It was my dad. He'd finally returned. I rushed to the door, hoping to warn him before it was too late. But as soon as I opened it, I froze. Standing there, facing my father, was one of the men from the van. His face was cold, expressionless. "I think it's time you told her everything," the man said to my dad, his voice cold and dangerous. I felt my blood run cold as I watched the exchange between my dad and the stranger. The tension in the air was suffocating, and I could sense that whatever was about to happen would change everything. My dad stood motionless for a moment, staring at the man, then slowly turned to look at me. His face was pale, and I could see the exhaustion in his eyes. He looked as though he was about to say something, but the words didn't come. Finally, he stepped aside and let the man into the cabin. "Who are they?" I demanded, my voice shaking with fear and confusion. "What do they want?" The man looked at me with a piercing gaze, his eyes cold and calculating. He didn't answer me immediately but instead turned to my dad. "I'm sorry, John," the man said, his voice low. "But she has to know the truth. It's the only way she'll be safe." "Safe?" I repeated, my heart hammering. "From what?" There was a long pause before my dad spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "From the people who are after you." I could feel the ground beneath me tremble as everything I thought I knew began to crumble. People after me? What was he talking about? The man glanced at me again before finally answering. "Your mother, she wasn't just running from some ordinary threat. She was involved in something much bigger. Something dangerous." My mind was spinning, trying to process everything. The man's words felt like a nightmare, too surreal to be real. "Your mother," he continued, "was part of an underground operation. An organization that, well, let's just say, they don't like people leaving. And they never forget." I felt dizzy. My real mother, who was she? What had she been involved in? And why hadn't my dad told me any of this before? The weight of the man's words hung in the air, suffocating me. My mind was racing, but it felt like I was stuck in slow motion, unable to process the gravity of what I was hearing. "Who are these people?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "What do they want with me?" The man sighed deeply, glancing at my dad before turning back to me. "Your mother was part of an organization, an underground network. They were involved in some very sensitive, very dangerous things. Things that, if they ever came to light, could destroy a lot of powerful people. People who will stop at nothing to keep their secrets hidden." I felt the ground shift beneath me. My whole life had just been turned upside down. The woman I thought of as my mother, the people who raised me, were they hiding something far darker than I could imagine? How could they keep this from me? "And now they're after you," the man continued. "Because of your connection to her." I shook my head, trying to make sense of it all. "Why didn't you tell me before? Why keep this from me?" My dad looked away, his face filled with regret. "We were trying to protect you. From everything. From the truth. And from them. But it's too late now," the man interrupted, his voice harsh. "They've already found you." A chill ran down my spine. The man's words didn't just scare me, they paralyzed me. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. "They've been watching you," he said simply. "They've been tracking your every move, ever since you started asking questions about your mother. They know everything about you, your family, and they won't stop until they get what they want." My dad took a step toward me, his expression desperate. "We have to leave. We have to get out of here, before it's too late." But it was already too late. I felt it in the air, the tension, the weight of their eyes on me. There was no escaping this. I wasn't just a normal teenager anymore. I was caught in something much bigger than me, something that had been waiting for me for years. Panic surged through me as I realized what was happening. Everything I knew, everything I trusted, was unraveling right before my eyes. My dad wasn't just my dad anymore. He was a man who had been hiding a secret so massive that it could ruin everything. I wasn't just the daughter of the people who raised me, I was someone connected to a dangerous, shadowy world that I didn't understand. "What do you mean they found me?" I repeated, my voice rising in panic. "Who are they? What do they want?" The man stepped closer, his expression hardening. "They want your mother. And now they want you, because you're the key to finding her." I felt the air grow colder, the weight of his words sinking in. My real mother wasn't just a missing person. She was the center of something far more sinister than I could have ever imagined. I looked at my dad, searching his face for some hint of explanation, but all I saw was regret. "We need to leave," my dad said urgently. "Now. There's no time to explain." I stood frozen, unsure of what to do. My mind was racing with questions, but one thing was clear, my life would never be the same again. The life I knew, the people I trusted, none of it was real. I was living in a world I didn't understand, and the more I learned, the more I realized how much danger I was in. Before I could say anything else, the man spoke again. "You have no choice. If we stay here any longer, they'll find us. They'll find you." I looked at my dad, hoping for some reassurance, but he couldn't meet my eyes. He was scared. For the first time in my life, I saw fear in his eyes. That terrified me more than anything. "We have to go now," my dad said, his voice shaky. "It's the only way to keep you safe." We packed in a frantic rush, hardly saying a word. My mind was still reeling from the revelations. The pieces of my life that I thought I understood were slipping through my fingers. Who was I really? What had my mother been involved in? And why had no one told me any of this? As we loaded into the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in. Every little sound, every passing car, felt like it was part of some larger plan to track us down. The man, who had introduced himself as John's contact, was driving now, and my dad sat in the passenger seat, glancing nervously behind us every few seconds. "How long until they find us?" I asked, my voice trembling. John glanced at me in the rearview mirror, his expression grim. "I don't know. It could be hours. It could be days. But they will find us." The words felt like a punch to the gut. How was I supposed to live like this? Always looking over my shoulder, never knowing if the next moment would be my last. My dad turned in his seat to look at me. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I didn't want you to have to live with this. But now you know. And we're going to do everything we can to keep you safe." "Safe from what?" I demanded. "Safe from who? Who are these people?" John's face tightened, and he shook his head. "They're called the Syndicate. A powerful group that runs operations across the globe. And they want your mother back. They think you know where she is, and they'll stop at nothing to find her." I felt my stomach twist into knots. The Syndicate? My mother was connected to something that vast? That dangerous? And they're watching us? I asked, barely able to believe it. "How do you know they're watching?" John paused for a long time, his fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. "They're always watching. They have eyes everywhere. And right now, they're looking for us." The words hit me like a punch to the chest. I had been so naive, so blind to the truth. My entire life had been a lie. The tension in the car was palpable. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat as I watched the black SUVs grow closer. It was impossible to ignore the cold sweat that had broken out on the back of my neck. John's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles turning white as he glanced nervously between the rearview mirror and the road ahead. "We need to lose them," John said, his voice calm but laced with urgency. "How?" my dad asked, his voice shaky. "They're in cars. We're in a damn sedan." John didn't answer. Instead, he slammed his foot down on the accelerator, and the car lurched forward, the tires screeching in protest as we sped down the road. I was thrown back in my seat, gripping the door handle for support as the car lurched around corners at high speed. The headlights of the SUVs behind us were getting closer, their presence like an unrelenting shadow that threatened to swallow us whole. "We can't outrun them forever," my dad muttered, panic creeping into his voice. "We have to find somewhere to hide." John's eyes flicked to the side, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a flicker of hope in them. "I know a place. It's not far." My dad looked at him sharply. "Are you sure?" John nodded once. "It's our only shot." Without another word, he swerved the car onto a narrow, winding road that cut through the woods. The trees were thick on either side, blocking out most of the light from the moon, and the car's headlights barely pierced the darkness. I couldn't see the SUVs anymore, but I knew they were still out there, somewhere, closing in. John drove faster, the car's tires skidding on the uneven dirt road. I could hear the sound of branches scraping against the sides of the car, and the air in the cabin was thick with tension. After what felt like an eternity, John finally slowed the car, turning sharply into what appeared to be an abandoned cabin. We were deep in the woods now, the faint glow of the moon the only source of light. "Stay quiet," John said, cutting the engine and locking the doors. He turned to us. "We'll wait here. They'll be looking for us. We just need to give them time to pass." I nodded, though I had no idea how long we could stay hidden or how long the safety of this cabin would last. I wanted to believe that we could make it out of this, but the reality was slowly sinking in. There was no escaping this nightmare. We were trapped, and the people after us weren't going to stop until they had what they wanted. The cabin was silent, the only sounds coming from the wind rustling the trees outside. I could feel the fear settling in my bones, a constant, gnawing presence that wouldn't let me breathe. The minutes stretched into hours, and I sat there, wide-eyed, staring at the cabin walls, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't control. John and my dad had said nothing for the past hour. The only movement came from the occasional glance exchanged between them, but even that seemed strained, as if they were both holding back some terrible truth. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I turned to my dad, my voice shaking with a mix of fear and frustration. "Why didn't you tell me any of this? Why didn't you prepare me for what's coming? Why did you keep me in the dark?" His face was etched with regret, and for the first time, I saw him as just a man who had been carrying this burden for far too long. "I didn't want you to be involved in this, sweetheart. I didn't want you to know what your mother had gotten herself into. I wanted to protect you, to give you a normal life. But it's too late for that now, isn't it?" I said bitterly. "There's no such thing as normal anymore." He sighed deeply, his eyes clouded with guilt. "I'm sorry. I never should have kept it from you. But at the time, it felt like the only way to keep you safe." I could hear the sadness in his voice, but I couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. I was supposed to be his daughter, his responsibility. And yet, here I was, caught in the middle of some dangerous conspiracy that I didn't even understand. Suddenly, the sound of a car engine broke the silence. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. The distant rumble of engines grew louder, and I knew that they had found us. "They're here," John whispered, his voice tense. I scrambled to my feet, my pulse racing. My dad moved quickly to the door, peering through a crack in the wooden frame. "It's them," he said, his voice tight. "We have to move." John stood up, his face hardening. "There's only one way out of here." My dad nodded, and the two of them quickly went to work, pulling open a trapdoor beneath the wooden floor. The cold air rushed in as they lifted it, revealing a dark staircase leading down into the earth below. "You're kidding me," I whispered, staring at the hole in the floor. "You want me to go down there?" John gave me a grim look. "It's the only option we've got." I looked at my dad, searching for some sign of reassurance. But his face was drawn, his eyes hollow with fear. He was just as scared as I was. "Come on," he urged, pulling me towards the stairs. "We don't have a choice." I hesitated for a moment, then nodded. I didn't know what awaited us below, but I knew that staying here would mean certain death. I had to trust them, even if I wasn't sure who to trust anymore. The room felt like a prison. The walls seemed to close in on me, and the musty air made it harder to breathe. I glanced around at the dusty bookshelves, the papers scattered on the desk. I felt like I was intruding in a place that wasn't meant for me, a place where all the answers I wasn't sure I wanted, were hidden away. John moved to the desk, rifling through the papers with quick, practiced motions. My dad stood next to him, nervously glancing at the door as if expecting someone to break in at any moment. "Found it," John muttered, pulling out a thick file from one of the drawers. He opened it, flipping through the pages with a furrowed brow. I moved closer, my curiosity overwhelming my fear. The file was filled with photographs, documents, and maps. There were codes and strange symbols, some of them looking familiar in a way I couldn't explain. And then I saw it, a photo of my mother. But it wasn't just a photo. It was a picture of her in a place I didn't recognize, standing next to a man who was far too familiar. "No," I whispered, my voice shaking. The man in the photo was the same one who had been lurking in the shadows at the cabin, the one who had been watching us. He was connected to this somehow. "Do you recognize him?" John asked, his eyes fixed on me. I nodded, my mind racing. "That's him. The man who? Who's been following you? My dad finished for me, his voice tight. That's your mother's former associate. He's the one who betrayed her. The room felt colder now, like the air itself had turned hostile. I stumbled back, my head spinning as the weight of the revelation crashed over me. My mother had been part of something dark, something that had led her to be hunted by the very people she had worked with. Where is she? I asked, my voice barely audible. Where is my mother? John looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something in his eyes, a regret, a sadness. I wish I had the answer. But the syndicate is bigger than we imagined. And your mother? She's been hiding for a long time. We don't even know if she's still alive. The words hit me like a punch. The uncertainty, the fear, it was all too much. I had come here hoping to find answers, but all I had found were more questions. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from above us. The sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, came from the staircase. My heart lurched in my chest as I realized that the people we had been running from were here. They had found us. We don't have much time, John said urgently. We need to get out of here. Now. I froze, panic seizing my body. I didn't know what to do, where to go, how to survive. My mind was racing, the walls closing in. But there was no time to think. My dad grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the back of the room where a hidden door led into a narrow tunnel. Move, he shouted, his voice cracking with fear. John went first, leading the way down the dark passage. My dad was close behind, dragging me along. We ran, the sound of our footsteps echoing in the narrow tunnel, the air growing thicker with every breath I took. Finally, we emerged into another room, an old underground garage, filled with abandoned vehicles. John quickly unlocked one of the cars, motioning for us to get in. I barely registered what was happening. My body moved on instinct, the fear and adrenaline clouding my thoughts. We piled into the car, and John slammed the door shut, starting the engine. As we sped away into the night, I looked back at the cabin, now fading into the distance. But I knew that the danger wasn't over. The syndicate was still out there, and we were still being hunted. And I had no idea where we were going. All I knew was that whatever came next, it would change everything.